Okay, hi and welcome everybody. This is Robin with GFAS. We want to thank you all so much for being here today. We've got a really exciting presentation. So excited you could be here. I do want to do just a couple quick housekeeping things before we get started. First, make sure and let you know this session is being recorded. What's nice about that is that if you want to go back and view information, if there's members from your organization who you think would benefit from this, they can definitely go ahead and take a look at that. And within the next few days, I will send out the information about how you can access the recording once that is finished processing. I also want to make sure and let you know your phone lines are muted. That's only to help with any distraction you get from background noise, and we have so many people on the phone at the same time. But please feel free to use that chat box over on the left-hand side of your screen if you're having any technical issues. If you have questions for the presenters during the presentation, please feel free to use that. We may not get to your question right away. Don't worry, we've made a note of it. We may pass it along a little further in the presentation. Just like you to know, you can put your questions in there when you think of them. If we don't have time to get all the questions, we'll see if we can follow up with some of the presenters via email to get your responses to those questions. If you happen to be on the phone line only because you're having trouble getting onto the internet portion of this session, please feel free to send me an email to Robin, R-O-B-I-N, at sanctuaryfederation.org, and I'll be happy to help you out via email once we get the session started. So again, if you've just joined us on the teleconference, just to make sure you're aware your phone lines are muted, but please feel free to use that chat box on the left-hand side of your screen if you have questions or are having technical issues, and I'll be happy to help you out. So it's my pleasure now to pass this over to Kelly Heckman, who is the Executive Director of Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, who will get us started. Kelly?
Thank you, Robin. And thanks to everyone for attending. This is a really exciting crowd. Again, Robin mentioned, my name is Kelly Heckman. I'm the ED of Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, GFAS for short. And for those of you not familiar with our work, we are excited to be celebrating our 10th anniversary this year to meet our mission of continuously improving the quality of care for animals requiring sanctuary. And we primarily achieve this mission by providing an animal sanctuary accreditation program. And we use a set of 24 species-specific standards of excellence to guide our assessments that are available for you to download on our website, sanctuaryfederation.org. We also facilitate operational and financial support and also enhance effectiveness, recognition, and collaboration as part of our mission. And it is this latter point in which we bring you all together today with our expert speakers in a timely discussion about the laws that protect animals, especially birds. And we've been offering these webinars, this series. This year we have a series of 2 on advocacy, but we've been doing Avian educational series for the past 3 years in partnership with Avian Welfare Coalition. And Denise Kelly is here as the co-founder and president of Avian Welfare Coalition. And I'm going to hand her the mic in order to kick off the webinar and introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all for joining us today. Am I coming through?
Yeah, you're coming through. Hello? For me, Denise.
Oh, okay. Thank you all for joining us today. You're for our newcomers as well as some of the familiar names I see as on our attendee list. First, a special thanks to GFAS, my 2 amazing partners on all of our webinar series, Kelly Heckman and Robin Mason. For those of you not familiar with the AWC, we began in 2000 as a working group to help bring awareness to the concerns of captive bird welfare. And we also serve as an educational resource for the animal protection community, lawmakers, and the public. One of our goals when we started out was to address the growing need for shelter and sanctuary for displaced birds. And it was actually the impetus for our developing a dedicated avian shelter outreach program to provide resources specifically designed to help shelter and animal care facilities meet the short-term needs of exotic birds within the shelter environment. Through our partnership with GFAS, we were able to expand these services and our reach by producing series of 4 series to date of webinars that cover a range of issues pertinent to both shelters and bird caregivers. These topics range from on-site care in the shelter to placement, outreach, estate planning, and now to advocacy and the law. All of these are available on our website at the that link shown.
Denise?
Yes?
Denise, sorry,
Hello?
your audio is kind of shaky. It's breaking in and out.
Okay,
I'm
sorry. Is that better?
That's better. Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Working on the forefront to help ensure that humane standards of care and treatment are afforded to captive birds in all situations is something all avian rescue and sanctuaries work toward. But our efforts also rely on the ability to enforce those standards. We can improve standards of care in our own facilities, but that needs to extend beyond that. And that is where the law can work. Without the aid of enforceable protective laws that cover birds, all of our efforts are stymied. Over the years, AWC has fielded numerous complaints from caring individuals as well as from other rescue and animal welfare groups, citing situations of substandard care, neglect, to downright abusive conditions involving captive birds. In many cases, we were able to provide some guidelines that helped remedy the situation, but there were just as many where no legal recourse was available. To which most frustrated individuals responded, "There ought to be a law." And that's what brings us to this important session. From my perspective, efforts aimed at providing more legal protection for captive birds is sorely lacking. Part of it is a lack of understanding of the legislative process combined with a lot of misinformation and fierce opposition. We've asked a team of experts now to provide a summary of the current laws that can apply to captive birds, as well as suggested approaches to improving captive bird welfare. Each of the presenters will present on the specific aspect of avian law that they work on. So with that, I'd like to just introduce our speakers. The first is Sue Leary, is president of the American Anti-Vivisection Society and the Alternative Research and Development Foundation, and she's been their leader since 1995. Monica Engelbrechtsen is an animal welfare specialist. Yes, animal welfare specialist.
Sorry, you're breaking up.
Yes. Again?
You're breaking up again, sorry.
Okay. Sorry about all that. Okay. Monica Engelbrechtsen is an animal welfare specialist and AWC board member, and she's worked professionally in the animal protection movement since 1999, taking on multiple issues including wildlife conflicts, captive birds, pet shops, and animal testing. Tara Zuardo currently manages the Wildlife Protection Litigation and Policy Reforms for the Animal Welfare Institute. She has also worked on wildlife and animal welfare policy and legal reform projects for the Audubon Society, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and the Earth Island Institute. J.D. Schubert is a wildlife biologist, and he's been with the Animal Welfare Institute since 2005, working on both national and international wildlife issues and campaigns. I'd take a few moments to review their bios in more detail. The agenda will be as follows. Each presenter will provide an overview on each of the following laws as they pertain to captive birds, starting with the Endangered Species Act, CITES, the Animal Welfare Act, and a summary of state laws. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our first presenter, DJ Schubert.
Actually, I think Tara Zuardo is going first in this webinar.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, Tara.
That's okay.
So to Tara.
Okay. We'll get started with Tara
Great,
on the Endangered Species Act.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay?
You sound really good.
Wonderful. Okay. Okay, good. So, as all of you probably know, birds can be listed under the Endangered Species Act if the species is endangered or threatened due to any of the 5 factors that are provided by the statute. And those factors are the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of the species' habitat or range, overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes, disease or predation, the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms, or other natural or man-made factors affecting its continued existence. While the agencies can take the initiative to have species listed, typically the listing is done through the petitioning process that is conducted and initiated by citizens and non-governmental organizations, such as nonprofit organizations. It's very important to note that there is a difference between an endangered and threatened listing, and in terms of what is most important in terms of these differences, it's the prohibition on take of endangered species. The statute itself provides a prohibition on take of endangered species, but does not extend that same protection to threatened species. And when I say take, I mean harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to do any of these things. Now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service typically extends that blanket prohibition on take for a threatened species, but with a caveat that's very important to birds, especially parrots. And this caveat is what's known as the Special 4D rule. The Special 4D rule, which is again attached to only some threatened listings, allows for a certain amount of continued ownership, transport, and trade under some circumstances, typically with a permit, but not always. DJ is going to talk a lot more about the import of listed species in foreign commerce. I'm only going to say that the United States does have jurisdiction to list species that only exist in another country under the Endangered Species Act, even though it is a domestic law. This affects what U.S. citizens can and cannot do with respect to that species, both abroad and in terms of import and export. Of course, that being said, the United States cannot designate critical habitat in that other country. So now it is also very important to note that most all of the Endangered Species Act restrictions applies to commercial activities. And that's important to note simply because the federal government's reach in terms of federal law has a lot to do with the Commerce Clause. So the Endangered Species Act is going to apply, of course, to commercial activities, to states, not within states. So it's important to note this because a lot of rescues and shelters are going to be less affected by the listings than, say, folks who are doing commercial activities. But there are several other very important notations on this as well. For one, captive versus wild birds. It is illegal under the Endangered Species Act to have separate designations for captive bred versus wild individuals of the species. However, the service does not interpret the Endangered Species Act as prohibiting captive breeding. In fact, the service's interpretation of the ESA has typically been that if you are breeding an endangered or threatened animal, you are contributing to worldwide numbers. That being said, I feel it's important to note that several interests within the animal welfare community would argue that some conditions, especially poor conditions, do qualify as take. Another important notation is that the date of listing is very important. Birds that are born, purchased, or sold before the listing date are not covered. However, any activities such as selling the bird, commercial activities that occur after the listing, effectively activate coverage for that bird under the Act. So that's also important. In addition, the activity itself matters, as I mentioned, because the ESA mostly applies its restrictions to commercial activities. So if a bird has been legally obtained, you can travel with that bird or transport it as long as it's not part of a commercial activity. And perhaps most importantly, the Section 4D rules matter the most. So again, these are rules that attack themselves onto certain threatened listings, not endangered listings. And in particular, when it comes to parrots that are owned as pets, there is a group of parrots that has a very specific Section 4D rule attached to them. And this specific 4D rule, as I mentioned, it's going to allow for certain things that would otherwise be restricted. So it's going to allow parrots that are listed as threatened to be imported, exported, as well as sold in intra and interstate, so that's within the state and between the states, commerce, without a permit. So it's really important to note that this doesn't mean there's no CITES permits required. If you violate CITES, you violate the Endangered Species Act, and DJ is going to talk more about CITES and those permits. So that's important to note. What this does mean is that any parrot species listed in this special 4D rule can be transported in the course of commercial activity. It's basically removed that restriction of the Endangered Species Act. It's exempted a certain amount of trade, transport, and ownership. So what about birds that are not included in this special 4D rule? Well, this means there are going to be restrictions on the sale. You will need a permit, and you will only be able to get a permit if you can demonstrate that the sale, just the sale, not the transport, again, we're talking about commercial activities, not transport, that the sale enhances the species survival, is for scientific research, zoological exhibition, education, or what's known as a special purpose under the law. But continue to note that you must always comply with CITES and the Wild Bird Conservation Act at the international level. So this is the same for endangered birds as well. So again, we're talking about threatened listings that do not have a special 4D caveat and endangered birds. You can own them. You can sell them within the state because, again, ESA applies to commercial activities, interstate commercial activities in terms of restrictions, but you cannot sell to another state without a permit that meets the criteria that I just discussed. That being said, I want to add in that it's always important to look at the State Endangered Species Act to see if they place any additional restrictions on intrastate sale or sale of that bird within the state. Although many states do not add extra restrictions onto the Federal Endangered Species Act, it is entirely possible for a state to do so. If you look at states like California, they took it upon themselves to restrict, for example, the trade of ivory elephant ivory even before federal law did. So it is entirely possible that a state can have an even stronger state restrictions intrastate on the sale of a threatened and endangered species. And that is it for the Endangered Species Act.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move along to CITES, and DJ Schubert will be presenting on this. DJ?
Well, thank you very much, and hello, everyone. Is my sound okay?
You sound great.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm going to speak on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is otherwise known, or more popularly known as CITES. CITES officially entered force on July 1st, 1975, and today there are 183 country members of the convention. CITES is often described as one of the most effective multilateral environmental agreements, although there are some people, including myself, who question that how efficacious CITES actually is. For this presentation, I'm just going to provide an overview of the convention. I think the convention itself in writing is rather simple, but its implementation can be complex. One of the reasons why it can be complex is because CITES allows individual member countries to adopt what are called stricter domestic measures. So it's not effectively one size fits all for every country that's a member of CITES. The United States, for example, may have stricter domestic measures that a country like Switzerland may not have. At the end of the presentation, there's a slide on resources, and I do include my work email address so that if anyone in the webinar has any specific questions about CITES, please do feel free to contact me and I'll try to answer them. CITES primarily addresses the international trade in live animals and plants, their parts, and any products or derivatives made from protected species. In general, CITES does not address the domestic trade in species except in select cases, such as with the domestic trade in elephant ivory. There are 41,228 species and subspecies currently covered under CITES, including nearly 36,000 plant species. The species that are protected under the convention are included in one of three appendices. Appendix 1 is for species threatened with extinction that are or may be affected by trade. That would be international trade. There are 673 animal species and subspecies on Appendix 1, including 154 bird species and 10 bird subspecies. Appendix 1 generally bans the commercial trade in the Appendix 1 species, although this ban is not complete, as there are circumstances when Appendix 1 species can be traded commercially. The export of Appendix 1 specimens requires the exporting country to ensure the species was, 1, legally acquired, 2, to make a non-detriment finding to ensure that trade will not adversely impact the species in the wild, and 3, to issue an export permit. Importing countries must also make a non-detriment finding and issue an import permit for Appendix 1 species in trade. Appendix 2 is for species not yet threatened with extinction, but who may become so if trade is not subject to strict regulation. There are 4,838 animal species and subspecies listed on Appendix 2, including 1,278 bird species and 3 bird subspecies. Species listed on Appendix 2 can be traded if exporting countries make legal acquisition and non-detriment findings and issue an export permit. Appendix 3 is for species protected under national laws where cooperation with other parties is needed to control international trade. There are 148 animal species and subspecies on Appendix 3, including 25 bird species. Now, the way that species are put onto the appendices involves voting by country members. For species to be put on Appendix 1 and 2, 2/3 of the members present at a CITES meeting, which I'll talk about in a second, have to agree with the listing. For Appendix 3 species, countries can unilaterally place species on that appendix. Decisions about species listings are made at CITES Conference of the Parties, or COPs. COPs are held approximately every 3 years. The last COP was in Johannesburg, South Africa, and concluded in October 2016, and the next will be held in Sri Lanka in 2019. In addition to considering species listing proposals, CITES parties also consider draft working documents or debate working documents related to the interpretation and implementation of the convention. Those documents often result in resolutions and decisions that act as guidance for CITES parties in terms of how to implement or interpret the convention. In between COPs, there are meetings of the CITES animals, plants, and standing committees. At these meetings, among other tasks, various working groups are established to address issues raised at the COP. All CITES meetings are open to accredited international and national non-governmental organizations, and representatives of such organizations are allowed to actively participate in the deliberations of most working groups. Now, unlike conventions without enforcement provisions, CITES permits the imposition of trade suspensions against member countries not complying with the treaty. Now, it has been shown over the years that trade suspensions can be an effective tool to compel compliance with the treaty. But offending countries, at least in my experience working within CITES, are often given multiple chances to correct any identified problems before such suspensions are imposed. In other words, CITES has teeth, as some people say, but it doesn't use the teeth as much as many think it should. There are also questions regarding how many countries consistently make scientifically credible non-detriment findings before permitting the export of Appendix 1 or 2 species. If the basic biology or ecology of a species or taxa is unknown, which is often the case, a credible non-detriment finding cannot be made. Unfortunately, even when those circumstances are present, countries continue to permit trade in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 species. The so-called legal trade in wildlife, including plants and animals, was estimated to be worth more than $323 billion in 2009. Some question whether all legal trade is legal, given documented problems in complying with the treaty. Such problems include government corruption, use of fraudulent permits, and the laundering of wild-caught animals, including birds, as captive bred. Such so-called legal trade can adversely impact individual animals and entire populations. Now, there's also the illegal trade in wildlife, which many of you have probably heard about and read about because it frequently makes the news all around the world. The illegal trade in wildlife, including in birds, may be worth as much as $150 billion annually. Such illegal trade can decimate wild populations, harm individual animals, and kill people. Birds traded illegally can experience a high mortality rate due to cruel handling and shipment. For people, it has been estimated that over 1,000 wildlife law enforcement officers have been killed in the line of duty during the last decade. In addition, organized criminal syndicates and terrorist organizations engage in illegal wildlife trade to fund their insidious activities. Fortunately, particularly in the last decade or so, there are considerable efforts being made by governments, Interpol, non-governmental organizations, and other entities to combat illegal wildlife trade by strengthening national laws, increasing penalties, and improving the capacity of law enforcement officials to effectively combat wildlife crime. Now, welfare is obviously an important issue for the Animal Welfare Institute, who I work for, and for those of you on the call. CITES has not adequately addressed animal welfare issues associated with wildlife trade. For species listed on Appendix 1, 2, and 3, CITES does require that they be shipped to minimize the risk of injury, damage to health, or cruel treatment. CITES relies on the International Air Transport Association guidelines on shipping live animals as its standard to ostensibly ensure the humane treatment of live animals in trade. In addition, for live Appendix 1 animals in trade, the importing country must ensure that the destination facility is, quote, suitably equipped to care for the species, end of quote. Also, for a limited number of Appendix 2 elephants and rhinoceros in trade, they can only be sent to, quote, appropriate and acceptable destinations, end of quote. CITES has not adequately defined these terms, nor are there criteria to help countries implement these requirements. Notably, and this is a very important point, CITES has no standards to address the trauma and suffering associated with the capture, handling, and care of live animals before shipment. Fortunately, animal welfare concerns have recently received new attention within CITES. This includes an agreement to establish a working group to discuss these concerns. While it is premature to speculate as to the results of these discussions, there are a number of welfare-oriented organizations, including the Animal Welfare Institute, who will be involved in these deliberations. Within the United States, CITES is implemented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the statutory authority of the Endangered Species Act, as Tara mentioned. In regard to the trade in birds, in addition to CITES and the ESA, the Wild Bird Conservation Act is also relevant, as are requirements imposed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and individual states. For more information about these laws, please check out the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, which is not included on this slide, which is at www.fws.gov. For specific CITES information, you can also go to www.fws.gov/international/CITES/. That's also not on this slide. The slide does provide additional information about CITES, including the website for the CITES Secretariat and the UNEP WCMC CITES Trade Database. That UNEP WCMC stands for the United Nations Environment Program Wildlife Conservation Monitoring Center, and they maintain a database that tracks all CITES protected species in trade. That database is publicly accessible. It's easy to use. So if you go to that website on the screen, you should be able to do research and learn how many CITES-listed species of whatever species or taxa you're interested have been traded from 1975 through, for now, 2015. They constantly update that database, so eventually 2016 data will also be available. If you're interested in trade data involving all wildlife, not just CITES-listed species, imported or exported from the United States, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages the Law Enforcement Management Information System. That's LEMIS or LEMIS. That data is available using FOIA from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In addition, if you're interested in truly understanding the U.S. implementing regulations for CITES, those are available at 50 CFR 23. And if you do a Google search using 50 CFR 23, you should be able to come up with that you should be able to download that set of regulations. I thank you for your attention, and again, if any of you have questions about CITES that I might be able to answer, feel free to contact me at the email address on the slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, DJ. Now I am going to pass this over to Sue Leary, who will be discussing the Animal Welfare Act.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers of this webinar for inviting me, and to everyone for attending. I'm going to go through this in a more casual way. I know there's some people on the call who probably know plenty about the Animal Welfare Act, maybe more than I do, but we've been involved in a very particular way, so very nicely the organizers have asked me to participate here and bring you up to date. So let me explain who we are. I'm here to represent the Alternatives Research and Development Foundation, and mainly we're concerned with developing and ensuring the implementation of alternative non-animal methods used in experimentation, scientific research, testing. A lot of you are familiar with, say, cosmetics testing, using alternative methods so that animals are not harmed. And we do that in various ways, including sponsoring scientific meetings and giving an award, that kind of thing. And as you'll see on this last bullet point, we engage in science policy because a lot of that might involve alternatives. And the Animal Welfare Act comes into play here because the Act requires experimenters to consider alternatives if it is expected that an animal will experience pain and distress. So that, of course, provides important motivation to implement alternatives that are available but not necessarily used. So that began our interest in the Animal Welfare Act as an important vehicle to help implement alternatives. So here's the timeline that kind of runs down. Now, it starts 1970 when the Animal Welfare Act was actually called the Animal Welfare Act. Before that, 1966 is when it was first passed, and it was called the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act. So you see where this all sort of came from. And through the years, there were a number of amendments that expanded the oversight of the Act. Again, this is a federal bill. This is U.S. law. So as Tara was explaining with the ESA, a lot of this comes out of commerce concepts. These are things that have to do with interstate commerce. But the Act has been expanded with regulations, but essentially the idea is to ensure humane care and treatment for certain warm-blooded animals that are either in exhibition to the public, they're bred for commercial sale, or they're used in biomedical research or transported commercially. So these are the sort of overarching parameters of the law. And here's a little timeline. You'll notice that even though it said all warm-blooded animals in 1970, the USDA, which is charged with enforcing the Animal Welfare Act, pretty quickly decided that they didn't want to get into regulations on birds, rats, and mice. The main reason for that was not about birds. It's because rats and mice are overwhelmingly the animals used in medical research and testing, and this affords them the ability to not have to regulate a very large number of animals, and it allows the science establishment to not have to report and provide transparency and accountability on the use of those animals. So we estimate that that's about 93% of the animals used in research. So the regulations exclude birds, rats, and mice, and the key there was really rats and mice, and that's how a lot of the animal groups took note of that and got involved. There was a lawsuit in 1991, and then we followed up, as you can see, finally with a lawsuit against USDA for inclusion of birds, rats, and mice to the AWA in 1999. And we actually did come to a settlement in 2000, and USDA did agree to regulate those species. However, Congress intervened, and you see 2002, there was a farm bill that was passed that excluded these animals, and I'll show you another slide that has the exact definition. However, what was interesting was that birds not bred for use in research, which were previously not covered in the regulations, were suddenly covered. So that means birds that were bred for commercial sale, which many of you are familiar with, birds that were going into the pet trade, were going to suddenly be covered by the Animal Welfare Act. And in 2004, USDA showed that they recognized that by inviting the public to make comments about how they might approach that. And we responded. There was a great group of animal organizations, including the Avian Welfare Coalition, that participated in pulling together some really great suggestions for standards that could be used for birds. Very complicated because birds are so diverse in their needs, and submitted those. And we also submitted comments on mice and rats. And the USDA rather quickly decided to utilize a part of their regulatory framework to cover what mice and rats, the few who were included, but they recognized that that was not going to be appropriate because it's very general for the birds. However, they never got around to doing the bird regulations. They have promised for years that it's a priority, and they have never issued proposed regulations. So I'll get back to that in a minute, but here's your official definition of animal in today's current regulations, and I put in bold here, highlighted what this term means. And you can see there are quite a few exclusions, but for our purposes today, this term excludes birds, rats of the genus Rattus, and mice of the genus Mus bred for use in research. So birds bred for use in research are the exclusion. Other birds are not. So we talked about regulations. Many of you know this, but just to run through it for those who might not, it's great to have a law, but the laws are generally pretty broad. If you say the law requires humane care and treatment, we all know, a lot of you are involved in animal care, that there's a lot of interpretations of that. So you need regulations to provide some kind of standard on how that can be measured. Is it humane care and treatment or not? So it's a very complicated process to enact regulations. A lot of people get to weigh in, and that's appropriate. And we won't go through all that in so much detail. But what would we expect to see in those regulations spelled out? We might see things about cage size, different requirements for females who have bred and they're young, temperature ranges, time restrictions, and enrichment requirements. Of course, we'd love to see enrichment requirements for birds. And as I mentioned before, this is the sort of scope for the Animal Welfare Act. We see animal dealers, transport carriers, exhibitors, who might be zoos, for example, or anyone who exhibits animals, and of course research facilities. So what would we see in regulations? We should see the kinds of things that we see for other animals. In the standards, we see the definitions for facilities and operating standards, animal health and husbandry, transportation standards. These things get very specific, but they're very important. That picture, by the way. So where are we? USDA has said that it intends to establish regulations to cover birds, and as a matter of fact, to this day, they declare that they are going to write those bird regulations. They know that they're in the law, and they know that it needs to be done, but we've been waiting since 2004, which we consider unreasonable. So our organization filed a complaint in federal court, it actually seems like a long time ago, but I guess in USDA terms maybe it's not that long ago, to obtain relief, and the case is still active. The fact is that we had an agreement with USDA that they were going to initiate the rulemaking, and our claim is that they have not done so. So what's taking so long? I can leave that to them to provide the reasons or excuses, if you'd like to say that. And where do we go from here? I do want to encourage people, though, to since there are a lot of people on this call who may actually witness commercial breeders who probably are violating the Animal Welfare Act because the birds are not receiving humane care and treatment. And I would encourage you to make complaints to the USDA. They will probably tell you that there's nothing they can do at this time because without regulations, there is, in effect, no way for them to go to someone and say, you're doing the wrong thing. However, I do think it's important that the complaints be registered. So if you do know of an instance where a potentially regulated entity is probably violating the Act in relation to birds, I do encourage you to submit your complaint to USDA because they should really know about it. Will it make a difference? Well, you see here a quite inadequate breeding operation. Clearly, this is not even sanitary, let alone humane treatment. And we'd like to see entities taking care of birds look something a lot more like this. And there's happy little African grays at Project Perry. So I wanted to give you some resources to this, a little bit of background if you want to get into what is the Animal Welfare Act. And I also did want to mention, you may have heard something in the last few days that the USDA has pulled down some of its inspection reports from its website. There's been some news today that they've made a statement that was as a result of some lawsuit that they're involved with. I wanted to assure you that's not our lawsuit. It seems to be a lawsuit from some regulated entity that is challenging privacy matters, and so the USDA's response was to pull inspection reports from their website, which is incredibly damaging to transparency and accountability and public access to information. So you may have seen a lot of animal organizations, including ours, not very happy with that. So we'll all be continuing to follow that situation, and you're certainly welcome to contact me if you have any questions about that. But anyway, that's good for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue. I'd like to now pass this over to Monica, who will be going over the summary of state laws.
Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit to make sure everyone can hear me.
You sound great.
Yay. Okay, so we've looked at the federal laws, and I'm going to do just kind of a brief overview of the state laws. Obviously, we don't have time to go through in great detail every state, but I'm going to kind of look at what are the kinds of things that states have regulated with birds, and then use California as an example of what's been done there and what can be done at the state level. And let me see if I can advance this slide. Did that work? So there's more detail. The link above there will give the detail and on the specific states and some examples there, the overview of current law and suggested approaches it's available on Born Free USA's website on that link. But in general, state laws can cover things like possession. However, birds commonly kept as pets are not usually included in states' laws that govern the keeping of other exotic and wild animals. They do sometimes apply to birds, but it's typically game species like exotic quail or pheasants, and also their laws will apply to the possession of things like hawks and owls, and that usually has to do with protection of disease spread for agriculture or public health and safety reasons, and protection of native species when it comes to like falconry and the protection of native birds of prey. Sometimes a parrot species will be included on a animal that's not allowed to be possessed, and it's usually something like the Quaker parakeets will be a bird species that they fear can form a free-living population and impact agriculture in some way. So occasionally when you get a parrot species that's excluded from state laws, possession laws, then it's usually because of some concern for the impact on the environment or agriculture. Pet stores is one area where birds will be regulated. There are 17 states that do have a defined level of care that includes birds. We'll look at a slide later that gives a little more detail. For breeding and dealing, there's 11 states that have some regulations that require either a license or record keeping for breeding, import, or export of birds in the parrot family, or birds commonly kept as pets. But notice, absent from those laws are usually anything that has to do with welfare. It usually has to do with public health and safety and disease control to protect ag industry. They don't usually have any requirements for animal welfare involved in those. For animal care provisions, there are some states that 6 states have statutes or regulations that do establish some minimum care standards for animals, including birds, that include birds that apply in any situation, whether commercial or private home. But obviously that's very rare. Birds can fall, of course, under general anti-cruelty statutes, but without specific language, sometimes it can be very difficult for cruelty charges to be brought because there's very little kind of understood in both law enforcement about what constitutes cruelty to birds. The situation has to be pretty egregious for them to kind of fall under the cruelty statute, but that certainly can happen. And states can do a better job as far as putting some specific requirements in there for the care and treatment of birds. Birds might also fall under transportation laws, and that there are some states that will require some level of humane treatment for animals during transportation, and this is usually birds kind of fall in there with all the other animals, so it's usually some real general requirements for food and water or temperature, and some real basic ones. So careful reading of each state's provisions would be necessary to determine whether or not those transportation laws apply to the birds that are commonly kept as pets. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to some specifics. So those are laws that provide some protections. Those states that I kind of queued up there, we can't go into detail, but those are ones to be looking at that do have some specific protections for captive birds that are kept as pets. And that's on the website there. You can look at what those laws actually say. So we're going to kind of go on to the next slide so that we can talk about some specifics. I will advance. So to go back real quickly to regarding pet shop laws, this shows a color-coded map. So the 5 states that are in orange, they actually have specific laws in their pet shop laws that are very specific to birds, to the care and treatment of birds. 17 states, the ones that are in blue, have just general requirements, and birds are included in the definition of animals, but nothing specific to the care and treatment of birds. And then the 6 states that are green, those are states that have pet shop laws, but they only apply to dogs and cats. And then the remaining, the 22 beige ones, they don't have pet shop laws at all, with no, specific laws that are specific to pet shops. They may, of course, fall under anti-cruelty statutes, would still apply to a pet shop, but nothing specific to the running of a pet shop. So as far as a case study and looking at what has been done, California updated its pet shop laws several years ago. And what's unique about this that kind of falls under the area of having specific provisions for birds is that, for one thing, the sale of unweaned birds is prohibited. I'll talk a little bit more about that law. And it also has really specific provisions so that in a pet care situation in the pet shop, a bird has to be able to fully extend its wings in the same direction without coming in contact with the sides of the enclosure. And this is important versus to say that animals just can't be crowded, because what does that really mean? So it's something that's specific and measurable to some extent, which provides some help to law enforcement. When they go in, they have a specific thing that they can point to say, this is why this enclosure does not meet the minimum requirement. It also has specific requirements for perches that are appropriate for the age, species, and size and condition of the bird. There needs to be sufficient space to enable each bird to fully extend their wings in every direction. That's, again, another, while each bird is simultaneously perched, so it's another qualifying that a measurement of sorts to help them tell exactly how and why the particular enclosure is not appropriate. They also includes primary enclosures for prey species shall be located where they cannot be directly seen by predator animals. So, of course, this applies to all animals, but birds being a prey species, this is important. So this means that you can't have your birds stacked right next to the pythons, something that causes stress to the animals or potentially causes stress being in view of a prey animal. Veterinary consultation and visitation at least once a year. And this is very key because it was one way to get at, there's a lot of little pet shops that just run and getting enforcement can be difficult, but if they're required to have a veterinarian come in there and visit at least once per year, they also need to work out a plan for care. This can really help bring up the quality of care and a situation in a pet shop. So that was one of a really key provision that's really useful for enforcement and for shutting down really bad pet shops, because no veterinarian wants to sign off on a really bad, poorly maintained pet shop. And there's primary enclosures providing animals with an enrichment device that is appropriate for the species. Of course, this applies to all animals, but also this is good for birds. So no more barren cages. They do have to have some form of enrichment. And then the record-keeping requirement. And this was important, too, for providing some sort of traceability, especially in border states like California, where you may end up with birds that are smuggled, birds into the country illegally. If they have to keep track of where the animals came from, then law enforcement can use that as a paper trail to actually look and find out potentially if a bird has been smuggled over the border. If they're given information, they go to the location of where these birds were specifically or supposedly bred and no facility is actually there. It's a tool that was put in there for law enforcement to help track the trade in illegal birds. So hand feeding, to kind of circle back.
Monica?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Before you move on to the next topic, we had a couple questions I thought might just make sense to dive into real quick on this. Who enforces those regulations in California?
It depends on your city. Sometimes the humane law enforcement has law enforcement authority. So it depends on whether or not your local animal control has law enforcement authority. And if that's the case, then they are usually the ones that enforce it. But if not, then that enforcement falls to the police because it is under, it's a law in California. And if humane law enforcement isn't charged with enforcing the law, then that falls to just general law enforcement to enforce the laws.
Got it. And then another question was, would the pet shop law apply to breeders as well?
No, it only applies to a retail sale, like a public brick and mortar pet shops. They don't apply to the conditions on private property or breeding.
Okay, great.
And yeah, so I saw the other question. So yeah, that I was going to get into that later, but yeah, it is complaint driven. So it is, as far as somebody asked, do they rely on people to report crimes? Yes. Especially animal law enforcement, they're largely complaint driven. They're out there dealing with barking dogs and loose animals. They're not typically going in and actively inspecting pet shops. It's something that sometimes falls off the radar, honestly. They're overworked, most of them. So complaints are very important for people to report when they see something that's amiss in the pet shop. So if it's okay, I'll circle back to hand feeding.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Unweaned Bird Bill, that went through. I'm sorry. So the prohibition on the sale of unweaned birds came before the pet shop law that updated those other ones. But it had to do with unweaned birds, just kind of quickly, is that hand-raised birds, baby parrots, kind of came onto the pet market to increase the popularity of keeping birds as pets. The idea was that if you hand feed your own baby bird, that it will bond to you. And that's also the stage when the pet quality is considered, the highest. So it was easier for pet stores to kind of get people involved in getting a pet bird and to convince them that their bird was going to be bonded to them if they hand fed the bird themselves. So many states already prohibit the sale of unweaned other animals, but allow unweaned birds to be sold. The problem, of course, is that it's not actually that easy to hand feed a bird. Lots of things can go wrong, including aspiration, choking on the food, or burned and punctured crops. Like the photo on the slide, you'll see that is a cockatoo that has had a crop burn, and that was a cockatoo in California. And they've also linked hand feeding to behavioral problems, later in life. So it's not true that it creates a better pet. That's completely false. But it was an economic thing because it's easier for breeders to push the hand feeding work or a retail pet shop to get those birds out of the store and into the hands of a private citizen to take on the work of hand feeding, despite the risk to the bird and to the person who, the emotional cost to the person that then causes these problems in the bird. So the unweaned bird law, it says that unweaned birds can't be sold, and that's defined as a hand-fed bird when the enforcement portion of this is that when a hand-fed bird under 1 year of age, the weight of that bird has to be documented on the sales receipt, and that includes swap meets and bird mart, so that this law goes beyond pet shops. And we had to define unweaned bird, and so that's any bird that requires hand feeding or animal assistance to sustain at least 90% of its own weight for at least 2 weeks. And that's why the weight of the bird is noted on the sales receipt, because it provides some proof that this bird, if he was a hand-fed bird under one age, that he wasn't able to maintain his own weight when he was sold. He wasn't actually weaned, and that's one way to track whether or not that happened, is that the weight is recorded on the sales receipt. It covers pseudoformes, so parrot species. And we did run into one issue. You can have the unweaned birds in the store, but you can't sell them. But in order to have them in the store, you have to, if you're a small store, you have to have at least one employee who's completed the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council's Avian certification program on hand feeding. And if you're a larger store like Petco or PetSmart, you had to have 2 employees. And we can get into questions about why we had to put that in there, but that's just so that the birds can actually be on the physical premise of the store being hand fed by employees, but they can't be sold to a customer. I know we're getting short on time, so just kind of go quickly. We also addressed in a separate bill in California flea markets and swap meets, and obviously a big problem. These are not pet stores, so they don't fall under the definition of pet stores. So here's some photos here at the sales events. They're often stacked in inappropriate conditions next to chickens, next to reptiles. There's disease issues, and then the other problem with these open air markets is where the animals are stored between sales. Some of them go back to pet stores if they are animals that are coming from a pet shop. Others are trucked into the event in trucks, and then they're stored between sales events in garages. So the other picture there with the cockatoo in the cage is an example of where they're stored between sales events, which is clearly some clear welfare problems there. So in California, there's an effective ban now on the sale of animals at flea markets and swap meets. It included all animals, but obviously birds were one of the things we were mainly looking at. So, but we do, there was a caveat here because we ran into problems with the Flea Market and Swap Meet Association. Now, the Flea Market and Swap Meet Association actually don't like the idea of live animal sales, and those swap meets and flea markets that are part of the association, all of them had already adopted standards of their own that didn't allow the sale of live animals, but there were other flea markets and swap meets that weren't members of the association that still did this. Their problem was that they run into problems all the time with different products not allowing certain products to be sold at flea markets and swap meets. They want to be treated like retailers. So they saw prohibiting live animals under the law as a step in that direction to prohibiting them from selling other things. So this is why we worked out this compromise that worked pretty well. It effectively said that in order to sell an animal at a flea market and swap meet, you have to comply with all of California's pet shop laws. And in order to do that, it's impossible to do that in a flea market or swap meet situation. And that's why it's effectively a ban. And that was only if a local ordinance had been adopted during the 2 years grace period that had those minimum requirements. So if a local ordinance didn't pass a law in that 2 years, then there's no way that they can sell live animals at flea markets and swap meets. I know that's a little confusing, but there is an effective ban, and that's kind of the way that we did it, and we can answer questions about that later. So the last kind of line, we've kind of gotten into it a little bit, is that legislation is hard, and you usually don't end up exactly with what you want, but you should do it anyway. It's about find lots of twists and turns along the way. But a key portions of this, once you have the laws in place, in addition to creating new specific laws, there's the concept of enforcing the existing law. And we already kind of talked about that before, that, once the work isn't done, once the law is on the books, the enforcement has to happen. So one of the ways that we can improve the protection of birds, obviously at the state level, are the examples I gave, the pet shop regulations, flea markets and swap meets, licensing and inspection requirements for breeding facilities. That's something that hasn't been done yet in California, but it is an idea. And there is available model legislation for pet shop, flea markets, and unweaned bird sales. And of course, education and advocacy is all part of that, because part of changing, when you change a law, it helps change people's perceptions of what are the standards of care for birds, but also it helps change the law, on the other hand, if people's perception of birds has already changed. So the two kind of work together, if that makes sense. But I'll just kind of wrap it up there because I know that there are questions. So thank you.
So, yeah, there was a couple questions, one of which is specific to Monica's discussion. Are bird fairs considered swap meets or flea markets?
If in the definition of a swap meet or flea market, if they are an open air temporary market, so a bird fair is the unweaned bird law applies to bird marts specifically. Bird marts is not under the definition of a swap meet or flea market, and that is because if they are open air, then they would fall under that, but not enclosed. So that isn't an area where we are able to, the special bird marts and bird fairs aren't included, but they are under the regulations of not being able to sell unweaned birds. And that's because the definition of a swap meet or flea market in California law was an existing definition. And to go in and change that was a whole other sticky wicket that we couldn't get involved in at the time.
And then someone asked about will we be given ways to take action? And I thought it might be a good question for each one of you, or at least, put it out there for each one of you if there is something that you feel would be, good next steps for people who are interested in making a difference on the legislation. Might be easier for the domestic and state levels.
Sure. I think my last slide maybe covered it. Some of these questions might have come in before those slides, but I'll just speak to that at the state level. Looking at first of all, look at your current state law. Look at your pet shop law. Is there anything there for birds? Can it be improved? One key thing when you're pursuing legislation is to go out, if you can, and document the problem. Legislators want to see what's the problem and this is being fixed. And then you also can roll in the model legislation and point to California and say, California's been doing this for years, because what the industry will say, the pet industry and different things, they'll go in kicking and screaming saying it's going to put them out of business. And that's clearly not the case. And so documenting the conditions and the reason, the need for the bill is important. And then, of course, coming in with model legislation and examples of where it's worked before can be really helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think looking at kind of the model legislation of what states have done to ban ivory is a really good model for how we can help prevent illegal trade in birds and the worst of the worst in terms of animal welfare concerns with bird trade and ownership. That's a really good model for how we can get stronger than even the federal level at the state level.
Great.
I would just like to point to the additional resources. We do have one of those links, which is a reporting bird abuse and neglect, which is sort of a step-by-step guidelines and mention some of the things that Monica had gone to about where to check for your state laws, whether or not the abuse would fall under that, and resources to other organizations that might be helpful in helping you put together a case. And most recently, the American Anti-Vivisection Society did a special issue on avian advocacy, and there was chock full of information there, including some tips and on how to address and what people could do, basically, to help push the laws and push more protection for captive birds.
Well, given our time, I think probably want to wrap up now. If there was questions that were asked and we didn't get to, we'll try to get those addressed via email. But I know that I want to thank again the speakers for a lot of really interesting and effective information for helping us kind of move our own advocacy forward. And thanks to Denise Kelly for her work and organizing the information, and Robin for keeping us all running like clockwork. So Does anybody else have a final word?
No.
If not, I will
thank everyone and to please, if you have any questions, as I said, you can send them afterward and we'll see what we can get them answered. But thank you all for attending.
Great. Thank you.
And I will just mention one more time that we will in the next few days get you information on the recording so that you can go back and view the information again or pass it along to others. So I will pass along my thanks also. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
That went pretty good. Ran over a little, but we expected it was going to run. I said it was going to run over 10 minutes. I knew it. Yeah. A little quick. I write out some nice speech here, and for some reason the phone was clicking in and out. And I think it came out okay. Yes, I did. They're right there in front of you, right in front of you, right in front of you, right in. I'll tell you, I like this Chrome. I've been using it. I had to use this for the meeting. It's very good. Mm-hmm.